Super. So our next speaker is Professor Helena Teede, who's just getting set up. Helena is Executive Director of Monash Partners Academic Health Sciences Centre, which, as some of you may know, is a very collaborative cross-sector organisation, and which relates to some of the conversations we were having this morning. She's a practising physician, senior academic and cross-sector leader in Australia and internationally, and a fellow of the Academy. She has established large-scale, high-impact networks and has worked with a huge range of partners to create national platforms that enable system-level change. These include co-production and implementation of a national learning health system framework. She has over 550 publications and maintains a family and a career, so I'm sure she'll be happy to talk about that as well, and is committed to supporting others to do the same. So, Helena, thanks.
Thanks. Oh, and it works. So thanks very much for attending today. I haven't seen James for a very long time. It was good to see James and others here today. So I'm going to continue on the same sort of theme about making a difference. As I understand it, most of the audience is still in their undergraduate degrees or postgraduate degrees or doing medicine. So I'm going to keep this at mainly that sort of level, almost around why I would think about doing research and when, more than anything else. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my career journey, which is not necessarily anybody else's, but I'll give you some insights on that. Some of the barriers and enablers that are there around career advancement, which are relevant to gender, but also to intersectionality. So really good question there before. A little bit about my research program and what I've done with it with my team. And then about the importance of leadership. Because one of the things that research gives you, along with a clinical career, which Christabel alluded to, is that real opportunity to lead and to influence and to impact. And that's probably one of the main advantages you get from research. And then just talk a little bit about how research is cross-sector collaboration. So I started my career, I was actually going to do nursing, and then decided at the last minute, because of some advice of a family friend who was a charge nurse in coronary care, she said, do medicine. Because if you love it, you can keep doing it, but you can never go the other way. So you can always go back to nursing, but you can't go to medicine. So I did my medical degree, and I did love it. I have to say, it was obviously my calling. And I then went on after medical school, and my year was the first year it was equal female and male people doing medicine. I then went on to do a specialty, and I ended up choosing the specialty that was the most diverse and the most challenging, the most interesting that I thought at the time, which was endocrinology, which is very much about systems, pathophysiology. And again, really loved it. Had some amazing mentors and role models. And the reality is that role models are really, really important in your career. Which is why people like Christabel, being able to come out here as a female surgeon, clinician, good all-round person and a mum is really important, because you can't be what you can't see. And when I graduated, and I'm not that old, there was not a single female specialist who was doing research and clinical practice and had a family. Not one. And I'm not that old. So I actually went to my male colleagues, and they were my male mentors. They were spectacular because they had what I wanted. I went on and did my advanced training, and I did that with my husband, who was a clinician academic as well. Both did the physician's exam the same year. Definitely not recommended. But got through advanced training, and then I took a gap year, and back then gap years were just not kosher. So we were both told that that would ruin our careers if we took a year off. That was it. Of course, it was stupid advice. And we went overseas, travelled all through Africa, had the time of our lives, and then spent some time at an international institution. So I would strongly agree with James. Going overseas somewhere, you can write to almost anyone, especially if one of your mentors introduces you. You could volunteer as a fellow almost anywhere and learn something. But I would say you don't have to go for a whole PhD or a whole postdoc or years. And if you're a woman with a family or a woman with a partner, so you're not necessarily quite so flexible, you don't have to go and uproot your whole life. You can do 6 months in the middle of your PhD, you can do 3 months in a postdoc. I came back 2 days ago from a sabbatical, which is also a spectacular idea. So I spent 4 months, as did my husband, overseas in Canada at the time, and actually designed my PhD while I was there, and he designed his. And that was spectacular, just you have time to stop and think and learn how other people do things. I went on and did a PhD in women's health, and then I had a family who I absolutely adore, never regret, and did not have to sacrifice my career for. Just to put that on the table. But I was standing on the edge of the abyss going, okay, how do I do this? I've got children. I've got a husband who's a clinician academic. I've got a clinical role, which was quite substantial and growing. And at that time, I'd got an NHMRC fellowship. And I went, what do I do with this? When you don't know what to do, you go and find people who've done things that you respect and you admire, and you find a mentor. And for women and for people who've got additional barriers, mentors are the most evidence-based way to make sure you make good career choices. So this is my capacity impactor. These are my two gorgeous daughters, and also my husband, who's a clinician academic. Quite funnily, when the ads from the Academy of Medical Science came out for this talk, one of my daughters is at Monash University, and she sent me the little thing and said, "Mum, is that you?" Because to my kids, they didn't think I had this high-flying career for a long, long time. They just thought I was mum and I happened to go to work, which I think is actually quite successful. So no regrets here, but a huge, huge impact. You have to be clever and you had to do things differently. And interesting, I've been on the National Health and Medical Research Council Healthcare Committee for 2 triennia, and then on the research committee, not the current one, but the one before. And we were having many discussions about how we address this gender equity issue. And the discussion I had with Anne Kelso at the time was, why is it in healthcare and medicine that we use evidence for almost every drug or any device, but when we've got a system problem, like how do we fix intersectionality or how do we fix gender, we don't go and look at the evidence. We come up with a panel of experts who've managed to claw their way through, and they're supposed to be the evidence. The reality is there is so much evidence in business. There is evidence in law. There is evidence in social science. There's evidence in engineering. There's evidence in so many sectors that healthcare doesn't think about, because we're healthcare. And one thing I would really like to encourage you to do is always think outside the square. I was speaking to one of the students outside before, who's in the second year of medical school, who started with an undergraduate degree in engineering and is now doing data science. That person is going to have a spectacular career pathway, because they're putting themselves at the juxtaposition of all of those sectors that often are very siloed and don't come together. So whenever we have a problem with in healthcare, and it doesn't matter the nature of the problem, research can help us answer that. So the research and evidence actually shows, for example, with intersectionality and the problems with gender, that the biggest barrier is actually capacity. So women do much more of the housework, much more of the outside hours work, and often then struggle at work. And the most important thing is workplace flexibility. So I actually went and negotiated workplace flexibility with my employers, which was a bit unusual at the time, but so did my husband. I remember I went to kinder one day to pick up one of my daughters, and someone came up to me and said, "You are so lucky." I said, "I am, but why?" They said, "Well, your husband does pick-up." I said, "Yeah, it's his daughter too." She said, "Well, my husband could never do that. He's an intensive care specialist." She said, "What does your husband do?" I said, "He's an intensive care specialist." Needless to say, her husband was there the next week. So you do have to negotiate flexibility. You do have to recognise you can't do everything. I've always had a cleaner, but I've had minimal time with a nanny because I chose to spend time with my kids, but I can't do everything. Capability, women have a major problem with imposter syndrome and confidence, and it's the system that creates that, not ourselves. So recognising that that's a problem and stopping yourself from thinking like that, and stopping yourself from thinking you can't do something, and getting your mentoring advice becomes really important. And credibility. Until recently, it was just not credible to be a female surgeon, a female surgical academic, the president of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, because we didn't look like that. They were grey, Caucasian males. In fact, doctors, until about 10 years ago, the community perception was they were grey, paunchy, balding Caucasian males. And anyone like a young Asian woman, or even myself who walked in, was just not a doctor. So the credibility changes as you have more role models over time. Even understanding the evidence on the barriers can help us overcome those. So one of the most important things is a mentor, and I've had many of them, and most of them, as it turns out, have been male. They have been spectacular, and the evidence shows they're really important. So they can be a sounding board, they can challenge you, they can tell you you can do things when you think you can't, they can role model, they can guide, and even more so, they can sponsor. So I have a whole lot of alphabetical letters at the end of my name now, and most of those came from nominations by my sponsors. The Academy, the Order of Australia. I would never have put myself up for any of those, but my sponsors did. So on my journey, I initially ended up in a number of leadership roles. So I had this PhD, I had my clinical role, I was juggling them, and I just was tapped on the shoulder and offered opportunities with these fantastic mentors that I had. Then I started getting headhunted, and it was always sort of almost accidental. I didn't plan a career step by step. But then, and for me this was the most important thing, I got nominated for an exec MBA. Now almost nobody in medicine does an MBA. And by that time I had 18 years of tertiary education. That was the best education I have ever had and had the most impact on my career. It doesn't need to be an MBA, but it made me think differently. It made me recognise that leadership is a skill. You have to develop it. You don't have it because you're intelligent. IQ does not make you a good leader. You are not a leader because you're in a leadership position. You need to understand it has skills, expose yourself to it, and if you want to have impact, get some training around it. So you get skills, you get self-awareness, you recognise your strengths and weaknesses, and I then went on to do a community leadership program and learnt how to be courageous. So I also learned why I go to work, because I love spending time with my kids. I was actually quite happy to spend more time at home. And so if I was going to do something like research or clinical practice, what was it going to give back to me? And I learned quite quickly that my motivators, my drivers, my energy, I never felt compelled to work, and I did it because I loved it, because for me it was about influence and impact. As a clinician, I don't know how many of you are going to be clinicians, it's tough, but there is an incredible privilege. Every time I see people, I have the potential to make things better for that person in front of me. Sometimes I may not, but so often I do. And when I work with other colleagues who are in other sectors, where in fact most of their job will make their shareholders richer, and they may not necessarily be able to impact, but I can impact every day when I go to work. And it is tough, but that is an incredible privilege. So again, if I'm going to do research, it has to be about having more impact. So I understood what my purpose statement was, which is I go to work to have an impact. The other thing is the facilitator said to me quite early in the MBA program, do you aspire to have power? How many people in this room aspire to have power? Ingrid's not nodding her head. Good. What does it mean to you?
I think it's the ability to be able to influence the world in the way that you want.
Great. So for me, back then, that's what this was. Power was authoritarian, top-down control, Ingrid shaking head. Most women perceive power like this and they don't want a bar of it because it's not what they want to do. But he challenged me that what right did I have to think that influence and impact was not the ultimate form of power, because top-down authority disappears the moment you're out of office, like Trump, or should disappear. But in fact, influence where you work with people was much more likely to be more sustainable as power, and that revelation probably changed my career. The other thing was that I realised I could be a leader, not a boss. And so I stepped up into much bigger roles. So I had a clinical leadership role. I set up a new unit, which went from 4 clinical services to 28 clinical services, seeing 45,000 people a year with an amazing team and becoming a centre of excellence over 10 years. And that I had the confidence to do because I had really good mentors around me. I got my NHMRC fellowship, and I've been fortunate enough to have those throughout my career, probably because I did what James said, which was always focused on impact. If my publication was not part of the story to get to impact, if my grant was not part of the story to get to impact, then it wasn't relevant to me to do. I stepped up in president roles at a national level and then international level, but every time I asked myself, why am I going to do that role? What will I be able to deliver? How will I be able to influence and impact? So it was never about what's my next career move. It was about, can I do something different? The critical thing for me all through my career has been flexibility and mentoring, and research has given me that. So in fact, when my children were really young, I was doing a PhD, so I could actually be a bit more flexible. The other thing is the research gives you diversity, gives you so many more opportunities to be diverse in your career. And also in your career, think about planning around what's most important to you. What might be more important to you is financial remuneration, maybe it's position. Neither of those were my drivers. It was about influence, but therefore I planned about how I could have influence, and I got more and more courageous. So I think that what you get on top of being a clinician by doing research is that opportunity to lead and to impact. So I've done lots of really great things, and I've really been fortunate, and each time I can go away with what I've hopefully made as an impact or an influence at that time. I've done a lot of work around gender equity, and more recently research in that program. And in fact, I now have a $5 million NHMRC and partnership program doing research around how we address it, and it now includes intersectionality. So again, always remembering about why I was there. The other message I would say is that the community in Australia, which includes you, by the way, are the funders and the beneficiaries of research, with the exception of industry. They're also the funders and the beneficiaries of healthcare. And for some reason, we don't think we really need to start with what the community needs and what their problems are, or we assume we know. So this is just an example of one of the programs that my team now run, and this has been going for about 12 years. But about 12 years ago, this particular condition, polycystic ovary syndrome, affects around 15% of women. It takes them 3 health professionals and more than 2 years to get diagnosed. It is not well managed, and it has quite devastating impacts for these women. And as a clinician, I was just seeing them time and time again. I did not do my PhD in this field. But as a clinician, I was compelled to say, this is a problem, I need to do something about it. And I wasn't quite sure what, I was doing my research, which is fine, but I wasn't quite sure how we got to the next stage of taking our research into practice. So I held a national forum, led front and centre by women who had the condition. And they started with their stories, and we went for the whole day thinking we were going to come out with a research agenda, and at the end of the day we came out with needing guidelines. So we were prepared to completely flip from where we started to what was actually needed with our community. We'd been doing a lot of mechanistic research on cause, we'd done clinical trials on treatment, we'd defined the natural history, and now doing a lot more implementation research into practice. But we went on to do those guidelines. And if we think about influence and impact, then you wouldn't just do a guideline that's Australian, because the reality is the condition is neglected around the world. So with that leadership background and the research that we and others have been doing, Monash led a program funded by NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence, where we developed very rigorous guidelines that were adopted in 182 countries and are used around the world, and these are now being updated. So it was across 6 continents. It's now 42 societies and consumer groups. We had multiple experts, including consumers, involved, and it covered all aspects. But it also came up with a research agenda. So we knew the research that we were doing was most important, and we published it in multiple journals. But when we went on this journey, we said, okay, what's the most important thing? We started with stakeholder partnership with societies all around the world. We did the background research around the areas that were most important that we needed to work on. This little box here, Assemble Best Evidence, took us 18 months. We developed the guideline and the resources to translate that, and then went about an international campaign. So these are some of the resources. In fact, this is just the most recent report, and you can see some of the numbers there. You know, the actual guideline itself has 50,000 downloads. There's about 2,000 citations for the main publications. There's a whole range of different resources that people can access and use, and we know they do use them. And one of the ones we're most proud of, we've actually co-designed with our participants, which is our app. This is clever. So we did this with engineers and actually students, and the Human Design Lab and the Human Data Interface Design with a grant. And essentially this app now reaches about 24,000 women in the world with this condition use this app on a regular basis. It's completely evidence-based. It's actually got a chatbot function, so they put in what they're most interested in, the information comes up to them. You can see it's mainly used in particular countries, but it has pretty broad reach. I think it's 178 countries now. Now, I could never reach that many women if I was just caring for them with this condition. But when you have these sorts of opportunities, you can really have impact and influence. And just finally, if I've got time, how am I going for time, Catherine? Okay, all right, I'll be really quick here. Just to say, and there are many other examples I can give you like that, where we started with the problem and then we built to a much bigger program. But one of the things I'm doing now, which John Saville mentioned recently, is I've been the director of Monash Partners for a while now. And essentially these are research translation centres where we're trying to embed our research into practice to have more impact. This is the reality of what research and clinical practice looks like, and I showed this slide to the Vice-Chancellors of all the universities across Australia recently and challenged them around this. If you're in business faculty, so this university, biggest university in the country, has 10 faculties. Each faculty, my faculty, has 10 schools, lots of centres. There's all these wonderful institutes across Victoria. They all compete with each other. They actually are not well structured in a system that gets them to work together. My little painted one there is no matter how pretty you make them, they're still all siloed. So the great thing about your careers, especially when you're early in careers, you don't see those barriers and boundaries like you do when you're more senior. And it's often the students I work with, often undergraduates, who are the most inspiring, who can cut across this rubbish because they don't see it in reality. And we've set up a number of programs to fund them to do that, incidentally. So this centre, or these centres, are about breaking down those barriers and stopping us from doing this. If any of you become a doctor, or if you become, a specialist in your research area over time, the more expertise you get, the more sure you are that you know what the problem is. You will never know what the problem really is if you don't speak to other people and look at it from their perspective. The other thing is this university is full of rabbits, way down their rabbit holes, absolutely brilliant in their tiny, tiny, tiny area of expertise. So my job these days is to run around, get them to stick their head up and actually get them to play together. And the most fun time is often when we get students who've got completely diverse backgrounds. I remember we put an engineering student and a data scientist in with a co-design person from architecture with a burn surgeon. And the burn surgeon wanted better surgical clips for skin grafts. And the students looked at it and said, no, we don't need better surgical clips. We need a glue that's going to just disappear and allow the burn to heal. And of course the surgeons went, no, that means we can't operate. You can't do that. So we took those 3 students over to a wound nurse and they've developed a fantastic product that's going to do exactly that because they thought very differently. So it's about how you solve problems to working together. Very quickly, this is what the current research program looked like that sort of James alluded to. Somehow at the bench top we're supposed to come up with an answer to everything that's somehow meant to make it right through that program and actually impact clinically, and it doesn't. 97% of things have an attrition before they get there. So being focused on the impact you're going to have and working together, often from the original population health problem, is actually really important to make this work. For example, as a clinician, when I'm dealing with homeless, drug-affected youth who are selling their insulin needles and almost dying of their diabetes, I'm not going to fix that problem from a new drug on a benchtop. I'm going to need a completely different approach to do that. So we need to break down this paradigm of this simple concept of this is the way research goes. We need to work a lot more with the community about what the real problems are, and that community includes clinicians. Work together to make sure we generate things that make a difference, and the Burnett is an exceptional example of an organisation that does that. And make sure that what we come up with is pulled and we're not pushing it into practice because it actually solves their problems. The McKeon Review 10 years ago said that the problem with research around the world and in Australia is we just don't all work together. We all work in our own silos, so we just need to work together. It's harder than it sounds, but whatever you do, if you go on a career in research, make sure you always work with as many people as you can to make sure you have impact. And that's what these centres are about. This particular one, Research Translation Centre, cares for 3.4 million people. Melbourne Academic Centre for Health is similar, and they're about embedding research and translation into practice, and our purpose is to connect everybody, which is why I think I like the role. These are the people we work with, and our community is incredibly diverse. We create sandpits where it's safe for everyone to work together, and we do not respect the silos at all. We flip the paradigm so that research becomes a solution to real-world problems, not an end into itself. And just to remind you that it's really all about the community when you start and when you finish. No matter what you do, you should always make sure you remember that. And I won't go on to those last 2 because it will be too long. So there is no perfect career journey. Research allows you a great deal of diversity. It brings leadership opportunities. It allows you to influence and impact. Be brave. Be courageous. Get mentors because they'll help you do that. Focus on the community. Listen, learn, understand the problems that you're trying to solve. Leadership is absolutely key in this. And enjoy yourself, because I've had the most spectacular career and have, with few exceptions, enjoyed almost every day of it. And it is definitely something you can do and have a clinical career and a family, but you just need help to do it. Here. Thanks.
Thanks, Helena. Questions in the room. There's one right at the back that we might start with, and while the microphone's heading over, there's a question online, Helena, about how to find mentors, so I might ask you that, which is, how do I find mentors as a student or junior doctor? Being a junior person, I usually don't get to cross paths with people who are more senior.
So soft introductions are really good. So knowing somebody who can introduce you to other people. One thing you should know about mentors, and I'll actually send it through to the Academy so you can send it out to the attendees, but we've done recent workshops and talks on mentorship, and they're online, they're freely available, so you can link in and watch them. But soft introductions, knowing someone who can introduce you to someone else is really important. Structured mentor programs don't work. So being matched up with someone is not a mentor program. You have to find someone you admire, someone who's a role model, and don't be scared. I was you just a little while ago. Ingrid was you just a little while ago. When you look at people like us, you can't think, I can't go up and ask them a question, or I can't talk to them because I'm just a medical student, or I'm just an undergrad. Rubbish. You're exactly the same as we are. We're just a little bit older. Be brave, be courageous. And so we'll give you the links to those mentoring programs.
Great, thanks, Helena, and we'll share those. And I'll just reinforce that these people have given up their Saturdays to be with you, so please do come and chat to them to make it worth their while. At the back, yes, please.
Hi, great talk, and thanks for that. Just a question about your background as an endocrinologist and as a clinician researcher. So I put my PhD on pause to start medicine as well, and I haven't really considered what specialties to go for. And before putting my PhD on pause, my supervisor said that a lot of leaders in clinical research are endocrinologists. Why do you think that is, and how do you find that specialty complements research?
Yeah, partly because it came from a phenomenal role model. So one of the best founding endocrinologists in the world was in Melbourne. And it's actually just in Melbourne. It's not necessarily the rest of the country. If you look at, for example, PhD students who are endocrinologists, there's about 20 of them at Monash Medical Centre and here. And there's probably 10 more in Melbourne, and there's like 5 more in the country. So a lot of it comes from a spectacular leader who set up a really great system, and my role model was one of those people who inspired me to come after. So it's often inspiring people who create the environment. But it is fair to say the nature of endocrinology is very strongly pathophysiological. When I went through, there was not a lot you could do in oncology, and there wasn't a lot you could do in neurology either, and there wasn't a lot of research, and there wasn't much in respiratory. Cardiac, you could learn to plumb things and you could rewire a bit, but they were limited in their research scope. Endocrinology wasn't. So if you were academic, you went in that direction. But now oncology is probably the leading area of research. Neurology is really exciting. Respiratory, so it's really the nature of what you can do in the research field and what calls you. Would you agree with that, Ingrid?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.
No worries.
Thanks.
My bad.
Other questions from the audience? So I'll take the one at the back, because you've not asked a question yet, and then we'll go over here after that. While they're doing that, do you want to just comment more on intersectionality? Because we did have that question before, yeah.
Yeah, so intersectionality is much like gender. It's one of those things that adds on, and traditionally Crenshaw referred to it originally was all about race. So yes, there's lots of other things that intersect with disadvantage, like class, like socioeconomic background, absolutely there and real. One of the things that becomes quite empowering is when you understand what the barriers are, you can start to realise they're not you. It's really not you. When I do my Women in Leadership program, which I've been doing for about 7 or 8 years now, almost the first revelation they all have is they all have imposter syndrome. Every one of them thinks they either can't do what they're about to do or don't know how they got where they got. That's not because every one of those women don't have confidence. It's because the system has created an environment where they just don't think they can do it. And there's many reasons why, and intersectional issues lay on top of that. But the problem is all the same. It's a system. It's not the individual woman or the individual person with the intersectional barriers. It's the environment in which you work. So that research program I referred to before is about changing the system in which we work.
Great. Thanks, Helena. At the back, yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks so much for a great talk. You spoke a lot about the importance of leadership in this field. I guess I was wondering if you could advise on sort of specific strategies to develop leadership beyond just trial and error and sort of seeing how you go, because I think that's often sort of standard approach, but I think, like, are there specific ways you would recommend to develop leadership skills?
Yeah, definitely. Dip your toe in the water. There are lots of leadership opportunities in undergraduate level. I mean, I know down the front here was talking to you earlier, you're in leadership roles already. So one of the things I became on my journey was the co-director of the Monash Institute of Medical Engineering. And that was fascinating. I learned a great deal, but I set up a student program in that, which was a summer scholarship program. And we fund a whole lot of people. For example, that burns analogy I gave you before. The students who are in that program run the whole thing. They're all in leadership roles. They're dynamic and amazing. And in fact, one of them is now my PhD student, and he's a data scientist engineer who writes code on GitHub. He comes to a meeting in my team, and a week later, he's written an open source code that allows my whole team to do stuff in a week that we used to take a year to do. So that sort of really cross-sector type of opportunity. But to come back to your question, stick your toe in the water. Go and get career opportunities that are just incremental. Be brave. You are a smart, capable person. You just are early career, and that doesn't have to hold you back. And also go and get a bit of training, but avoid the really expensive courses. For some reason, when you stick the word leadership in a program, it's $10,000 and business schools make money. Avoid those. But do go and find out more about it, even if it's just a 2-day course, and jump off a cliff and swim in the water.
Thanks, Lynn. I feel like we all need you on speed dial for a pep talk in those key moments. Where was the question? Oh, just over here, sure.
Hi. So what you said about the silos, doing an interdisciplinary PhD, that really resonated.
Yes.
I'm wondering what you think the best way at the system level to address that is.
Yeah, very challenging. So that's what these centres are actually all about. Find yourself a mentor who does it. Find yours, and there are not that many of them, but find a mentor who does it, who actually works across disciplines and can give you advice about strategies to broach those. And remember, it's the system, not you. So you can push through those things that you don't think, you get all this resistance because it's not quite right. It's not you. It's the system, so you've got to work ways around it, and you need mentors to help you. And keep going, because the gold is always in between the silos.
And where was the question? Oh, just in the middle here, and that's probably the last one we'll take. Oh, you've got the mic. Great, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. I guess you've kind of already answered it, but I'll just ask it anyway. It's been my experience that with a lot of the more intensive training programs, it's almost kind of discouraged for women because it's just going to be too much and we can't do everything. So I guess do you think that the sphere is changing and becoming, I don't want to say more accommodating, but becoming more flexible for us to complete training and actually have family? Or do you think it's more about that we just need to be going and saying exactly how we're going to do things and what we want, how to structure our training programs, or,
Yes. This is not your job to fix. Okay, it's not about the individual. And one of the most empowering things I remember I went through was when I started reading the research around why it was so hard to push through some of these barriers and why I felt like I was an imposter. And I remember I was tapped on the shoulder, and I got my professorship in medicine at 38, which was unusual. And I remember going to the room and everyone came up and asked me for the minutes because they thought I was the secretary. And I was one of 78 people in the room with 2 other women, and they were not doctors, they were professors of something else. And the reason I got there was I was headhunted for a role that was a professorial role. So if I'd done the normal thing, I wouldn't quite got there at the same time. And I tried to negotiate with the organisation to get an associate professor role because I didn't think I was quite ready for a professor role and all. And the head of the board looked at me and he said, "What is your problem? Never would I have a male who I tapped on the shoulder and said, 'We think you can do this job, we really want you,' who would say, 'Oh, I don't think I'm good enough, please pay me less and don't give me the title.'" And I remember just being so struck by that. I can't believe I did that. And so I started looking at the evidence around it and realised it is systems and cultural problems. It is getting better because we're understanding it. And people like me and others have got big research programs that are changing it. And people like Ingrid as the president of the academy, people like Anne Kelso, who's the CEO of NHMRC, people like Christabel, hopefully people like me, are starting to break some of those barriers and try and fix the system for you. So you can be aware of it and realise it's not personal, but you don't have to keep fighting your way through as an individual because it's not the problem for the individual, it's the problem for the system. Does that help? And it's getting better.
Great, thanks Helena so much. We're probably going to have to end it there, and thank you. Yes, please join me in thanking Helena.